HX52 is one of the most overrated turbos, so in this video I'm going to explain why I think that. The HX52, there's more than one version of that, and one model has a 65mm compressor wheel, which I'll show you pictures of this one that I rebuilt and did a T51R mod to. This compressor wheel is not much bigger than the HX40. The HX40 starts at 58, well there's actually a 56mm version, but it's really rare. And the more common version, there's an 8-blade 58 or 57.9 compressor wheel size, and then there's a 60mm, which is much more common than the 8-blade. The upgrade options for the HX40 and 35 series are capable of being larger than the HX52 compressor wheel, which is one of the main reasons why I think the HX52 is overrated, because you can get a much bigger compressor wheel in the HX40 and 35 series than you can in the HX52. The HX52, there is a 65mm version, which is the one that I rebuilt, and I think that there is a 67 version, so that would be about the same size as the compressor wheel that I use in the HX40s. The advantage of the HX52 is they have a really big exhaust housing and a really big turbine wheel. The turbine wheel is 70mm by 84mm on this one that I rebuilt, and also the turbine housing, there's no options to go with any smaller of a turbine housing. The one that I worked on in the past, this one didn't come with the housing. The one that I worked on in the past, I think it had a T4 or a T6 housing that was like a 16 cm, but it looks a lot larger than a normal 16 cm like from an H1C. There's no option to get anything smaller for an exhaust housing to help that spool up. HX52, they have really big housings on the compressor side and the exhaust side, which that's so much volume for the turbo to fill to be able to spool it up. I think it makes more sense. The main reason why I think it's overrated, and I think it makes more sense to go with the HX40 67 series, is because you can get a larger or possibly same size compressor wheel in the HX40 series, which is going to help with the spool up. And then on the exhaust side, you could still go to a big turbine, but not as big as the HX52, which would be a 67 by 76 turbine. That's only 3mm smaller than the HX52's 70mm turbine wheel, which is probably more beneficial anyway, because most people aren't going to be putting a turbo on to make more than 1,000 horsepower anyway. So if you have goals of making 950 horsepower, the HX40 67 is capable of doing that. It just really depends on what setup you're putting that on. So if you're putting it on a gas vehicle, you're much more likely to hit that horsepower. If you don't, then you can go with bigger turbine housing options to be able to get there. With the HX40 67 series, the options for turbine housings is the smallest is the T3.82, and then you can go up to the T4 series, where you can go with a .81 or a .84 depending if you want it divided. And then there's also the option of the 1.15 or the .96 depending on if you want it a divided or open scroll turbine housing. I was saying, with the HX52, there's no turbine housing option to make it any smaller, and it's already so big, so it's just going to take so long to spool that size of a turbo up because of the massive turbine wheel and turbine housing that's on it. Now, I think the HX52 could be useful, but it's not very practical for most street cars. Like the HX52 might work well on like a much larger displacement motor, like maybe a 6 or 7 liter V8 or something along those lines, or maybe even an 8.3 Cummins possibly. For most people that want to put it on a 4-cylinder, in my opinion, you may as well just go with an HX40. You can go with something between the 60 millimeter range, so between the 700 horsepower range to the 950 horsepower range, and you won't have to sacrifice as much spool up. And I think that's important, because most people that are putting big turbos on there, they think in terms of making horsepower, but they don't think in terms of if that turbo is ever going to spool up or how long it would take to spool up. Because the practicality of putting that size of a turbo on there and you plan to make power or trying to win some kind of drag race or something is never going to happen, because your turbo is never going to spool up to begin with unless you just put a bunch of NOS on there, and then you might have a chance. If anyone has had any luck out of the HX52 making power or being a streetable turbo, I'd like to hear your comments below, because I'm curious, because I just think this is one of the most overrated turbos that people have decided to put on street cars.